everybody. Welcome to another webinar here at Route Consultant. My name is Josh Gregory. I am the Vice President of Education here at Route Consultant. So if you've never been here, if this is your first webinar, welcome. And many of you, you've been to a few of these, maybe hundreds at this point. So I again, always want this to be a place where we can come together, whether you're a new buyer, new investor into the space, looking at this for the first time, or you're a current contractor who looking for more ways to improve and optimize their business. That's still what we want this webinar to be, a place where we can learn from each other. Now, before I go too far, I do have to quickly read the disclaimer as I do every week. So Route Consultant is not endorsed by and is not recommended by Federal Express Corporation, FedEx Ground, or Amazon. Route Consultant is not sponsored by, is not approved by, is not associated with, and has no connection whatsoever with Federal Express Corporation, FedEx Ground, or Amazon. So again, I always have to say that every week. It's important. But for everybody who's here for the first time, just so you have a general sense of the flow of today, I will be going over some content, and then we will go over some updates on a couple of things, and then we will open it up for a pure Q&A at the end. So any questions you have as I'm talking today, or any questions you may have about the FedEx space, about the Amazon space, about the logistics space as a whole. There's a few different places that we can jump in and answer questions on. So anything that you have today, we're going to be here to answer those questions. But when we get to that point, make sure that you're putting your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of the window. If you put it in the chat, I'm going to miss it. So if you want your questions answered, if you want to talk through this, make sure you put it in the Q&A button at the bottom. I did want to, for those of you who noticed, I might be wearing a little bit more tropical of a shirt today. The analyst team here on Wednesdays always wears Hawaiian shirts, so I thought I would finally stand with them and support them in their tradition by wearing Hawaiian today as well. So for those of you who want to join some Route Consultant traditions here and just love coming to these webinars, you can also wear your Hawaiian next Wednesday. Now, like I said, from a content perspective, today, we're actually going to go over some really critical things to think about when it comes to your fleet strategy. But the first thing that you need to think about is what I just said, fleet strategy. This is the business of people and trucks, and you need an effective, comprehensive strategy for both if you want to be successful. So before we get too far into it, I'm going to go ahead and bring Jesse Smith on, who's our Director of Operations here. Jesse, hey, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Josh, thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, perfect. So Jesse and I are going to bounce back and forth a little bit on a couple of things here, but we're going to be talking about a lot today when it comes to fleet strategy. So like I said, as we're talking, make sure you're listening, taking notes, asking and writing down any questions and putting it in the Q&A as we're going. So for your fleet, you need to think about, model, and plan a top to bottom strategy. And importantly, you also need to stick to that strategy. It shouldn't just be something you do theoretically on paper and then don't hold to it for the rest of operating your business. I want you, when you're thinking about this, to be able to quickly and succinctly answer things like, what's my monthly maintenance budget? What's my monthly maintenance target? What level of vehicle spend in a year is too much, is crossing a threshold, which is the point where I need to sell and replace a vehicle? What's my general vehicle retirement strategy? And your answer there should just not be, I will always run a vehicle until the wheels fall off and it breaks down on the side of the road. That's a good indicator I need to sell it. It needs to be more than that. And things like, how many spares do I have? What's the right type of vehicle for my delivery volume and for my territory? We're not going to answer all of those today, but those are the things that I want you to be thinking about, the types of things that need to be a part of your fleet strategy and that you should be thinking about on a consistent basis. And so if you can't answer all of those questions, if you've never thought through those types of questions before, I want that to be kind of a starting place to kickstart your thoughts on your own, whether you're already an operator or you're looking at acquiring a business. These are still the types of things you need to look at regardless of what type of logistics industry you're in. It's not just FedEx. These are the questions you need to be asking if you're running a fleet of any kind. Now, what I'm going to talk about right now is just through a couple of things you should be considering around acquisition and disposal of your vehicles. And then I'm going to kick it over to Jesse for some insights into a few other areas. Now, we found in our businesses that it was most effective to purchase new vehicles. We would then typically run them to particular mileage thresholds, and then we turn around and sell those vehicles and buy new again. So for P&D, we typically would say selling vehicles around about 150,000 to 200,000 miles is kind of the mileage threshold. And for line haul, around 500,000 miles. Advantages of buying new: it lets you reset the depreciation on the vehicle, so you can start that again from a tax perspective. You should have significantly lower repair and maintenance. And many actually will get a warranty on those new purchases for the first few years. And then when you're selling, you're still getting a residual value when you sell those old vehicles, because let's be clear, that 150,000 mile point is not end of life. Many P&D vehicles will go up to 500,000, up to 600,000 if they're diesel. Line haul tractors can go up to 1,000,000 miles. So those thresholds we're talking about is not that we're selling them when they've reached end of life. Those vehicles still have years left in them, but the repair and maintenance curve got to a point that for our strategy, that was too high. And that was the point where we wanted to sell those vehicles, and it generally fell in about those mileage ranges. And we'd, sell, start fresh, and recover that residual value. Now, when you buy new, you're also getting all of the newest safety features. You're getting significantly more reliable vehicles, which is really important depending on how many miles your territory is. You're also getting the best fuel efficiency and generally just all around better quality of life for your drivers, which helps on the retention side and on recruiting as well. If you have the newest vehicles in a terminal, the other drivers will notice those vehicles, and when they're looking for their next home, that is something they'll remember. So lots of benefits to that strategy of kind of taking it to that threshold and then buying new. But there are some important caveats that I want you to know as well and think through. So one is, if you're running a really low mileage territory, you may not ever hit that 150,000 mile point. You've probably heard us talk about it before. We used to have the Miracle Mile down in Chicago, where we might do 10 miles a day or less sometimes. And so those vehicles were never going to hit the 150,000 mile threshold if we're just running it under normal operations. So instead, you may look at targeting a number of years instead of a certain mileage point for when you retire the vehicle, because you could keep it forever, but typically there's benefits that I mentioned of bringing in new vehicles instead of running something that's 30 years old. Now, an interesting model that I've seen that we used and that several other contractors have used is to rotate your vehicles if you have any kind of mixed composition territory. So if your P&D territory is a mix of high mileage rural routes and denser suburban or urban routes, you can use your newer vehicles on those high mileage routes for a few years where you really need that reliability. You need vehicles that can survive doing 200 miles a day and not break down. They'll always make it back. And then rotate them to your lower mileage routes once they've gotten a few years under their belts, because those are easier routes to deal with. If a vehicle goes down, it's a lot easier to deal with recovering that vehicle. So you can kind of extend the life of the vehicles by doing things like that. For line haul, it's a similar thought process. So, if you're really high mileage solos or your team runs, you need to have really reliable vehicles on those runs. But once those have reached higher mileage, you can rotate those tractors onto your shorter solos, or your spots is the best place, where, a spot, you're going to be doing really low mileage, those local spots, and you can keep getting solid revenue out of the tractors well past the kind of mileage threshold where you'd be comfortable sending it across the country on a multi-day trip. The other caveat that I really want you to think about, particularly right now, is that you always have to consider the current market when you're trying to decide the best strategy for acquiring and disposing vehicles. Right now, financing expense is expensive and purchasing new is expensive. And so in many markets right now, it can make more sense to look at buying used. And it's, again, not completely end of life used. You don't want a vehicle that's still gonna break down tomorrow, but maybe something that's had a few years of work that you can get at a cheaper price. And still have usable vehicles on the road when you're kind of weathering this type of expensive environment. Again, you still want to have inspections and make sure you know what you're getting, though, even when you're buying used. You'll also want to use a lot of the tips and strategies that Jesse's going to mention in a little bit to make sure that you're being proactive around your vehicles to continue to extend the life of them as far as you can when it's an environment like this where buying is expensive. Now, last thing I'll mention around owning and running vehicles is that there are full service leasing options in both the P&D and the line haul space. For P&D, we point you to companies like Hello Truck Leasing. And then for line haul, we tell you to look at the companies like Ryder or Penske or Gator. And these are options that cover all of your repair and maintenance. And it also turns your future CapEx expense into a fixed monthly payment. Since you'll be able to run the current vehicle for 3 years, then turn around and renew the lease when you get a new vehicle. Full service leases generally give you the peace of mind of knowing you have the new vehicles on the road. It also improves the quality of life for the drivers, like we talked about with new vehicles, and it makes the operation just in general run more smoothly. You are paying for those leases. There's a cost to it, but remember that fixed expense that you're paying up front is something that you would have to pay at some point when you're thinking about in the future actually paying to replace that vehicle. It's just that instead of being a kind of a nebulous future CapEx to plan for, it's a fixed ongoing monthly expense. Now, I will give the additional caveat for the line haul side is that most of the line haul leasing companies do have minimum experience requirements where you have to be an operator for at least a year or two before they'll let you have leases. Sometimes if you're buying a business with those leases already in place, you basically get them to transfer the guarantor from the current owner to you, and you can still run them. But what may happen on the line haul leasing side is that you may have to start with an owned tractor strategy and then maybe shift over time to the leasing model and test it out once you've been an operator for a year or so. So lots more we can cover and talk about, answer questions on around acquisition and disposal. But for right now, I'm going to kick it over to Jesse. And again, we will have that Q&A later. So Jesse, you can go ahead and take over from here.
Thanks, Josh. So I want to talk about some really practical operational strategies. And again, if you're not familiar with me, I come from the P&D side. So I've tried to make my content relevant to both P&D and line haul. But if I say something that sounds like, I don't think that could apply to line haul, I'm probably just talking about P&D. So if I say something like that, make sure to ask me later and I can clarify. But in general, I'll be talking more about P&D with some line haul stuff thrown in here and there. So with that caveat, I just kind of want to give a general overview of what kinds of trucks that you should run on your territory. Now, we're not going to get real deep into this. As Josh said, we could spend hours just on this topic alone. But in general, there's a very good principle that you need to employ when you're looking at what kind of trucks should I buy for the kind of routes that I own. Now, if you're buying in as a prospective investor, you're kind of just buying what the current operator is using. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're running the right or best trucks for their territory. So a good rule of thumb to use when you're looking at a fleet analysis of are these the right trucks for this territory is run the biggest size vehicle that you can safely operate for each route that you're buying. So, as most of you may know, you're going to maximize your profitability, the better efficiency you can push out and the more productivity per on-road resource. So in other words, the more stops, unique locations of packages that you can fit onto a particular vehicle, the more revenue you're going to generate from that vehicle. But if you push that pendulum too far to one side and you put a big P1200 step van, like some people call it a bread van, if you put that kind of truck out on a country route where it's going to be encountering, wagons from the Amish people that are coming by. We've actually had territories like that where we would see Amish people on a regular basis. Those big trucks are not well suited for those rural routes. So you can run up against the factor of safety on the other end of that. If you try to push too much productivity, too many stops out on a truck that's just not suited for the territory because you're going to have a lot more accidents. So there's a sweet spot on each route that you have. But in general, you want to think about what's the most capacity I can push out on this truck. They can also safely operate on this particular route without having accidents. So that's kind of the general overview. I'm not going to spend too much more time on that. I'd love to get into more detail if somebody has a specific question on that, but that's kind of where I'll stop for now. So some specific operational strategies when you're at the station, thinking about things like bulk fluids and when to hire a mechanic. That's the kind of things I want to talk about. So let's start with bulk fluids. Now you can purchase oil in 55-gallon drums. Now, a lot of people don't realize that, but anything you can get in a 55-gallon capacity for a fleet is probably a good idea. If you can keep it somewhere where you can store it and you can get that much capacity at a wholesale price, that's going to be ideal. Oil is one of the main things. Things that you can buy in 1 to 5 gallon increments are typically going to be things like coolant, diesel exhaust fluid. You're going to have things like windshield washer fluid. Maybe you might be able to get into a larger size. Things that are able to be scaled and used across your entire fleet. You want to buy those in as big a size container as you can find. And again, at that wholesale price, if you can find it, that's going to be a good strategy. And also, if you can have similar trucks across your fleet, even if they're not the exact same model. So for example, if you've got P700s and P1000s, ideally you'd want them all to be the same brand, because they're probably going to use similar air filters and fuel filters, oil filters, things like that, if they've got the same motor in them. So if they're sharing parts between trucks, that's a really good idea, particularly if you've got a spare and you need to use that spare as a parts truck. Pull a mirror off of this. I need to swap out the battery because this battery has died on this truck. As long as you've got a spare of the same type, that's really going to be helpful. Not having a big mixed and matched fleet, that can kind of cause you to have to dip into your repair and maintenance budget a little bit deeper. So keeping everything of the same type is really critical, and buying in bulk. Now, a lot of contractors try to store their fluids and their supplies on the yard at the stations, and terminals, it's kind of hit or miss when it comes to that. A lot of terminal managers will allow you to do that. And you might even find the rare station that allows you to keep a little section of physical space inside the terminal to keep things like toolboxes and stuff like that. That's not really common, but you might eventually find something like that if you look hard enough. But in general, most terminals will allow you to keep a spare truck where you can keep all of your supplies in it, parked somewhere outside the terminal on the yard, somewhere where you can easily access it. So you don't have to go off site to get things like oil and funnels and filters and stuff like that. So if you can store it somewhere on site, that's going to be the ideal thing. If not, see if you can develop a good relationship with a mobile mechanic that will store all those things in his service truck. And then when he comes on the yard to provide the service, he's already storing them and then taking those things with him when he goes. That's kind of the second best option. Make sure if you're buying in that you ask the current operator what their bulk fluid or their storage strategy is. And it's going to be probably best practice, unless they're just they don't have any organization whatsoever, to try to copy that. And you're going to be most likely buying the spare vehicles that they have and keeping the same, operational workflow in place. If you're, the VC is going to be used to going out and finding the spare supplies on this truck or that truck. So try to keep things the same there, but make sure you check on that when you're doing your due diligence. Ask what the storage situation is for your contractor that you're buying, and the mechanical resources that they have on hand or may not have on hand. Now, another thing to think about is going to be oil analysis. And when you're thinking about oil analysis, this is something that kind of just is completely unknown to a lot of contractors. But there's companies out there like Schaefer's as an example, and they provide oil analysis. So you'll basically take a little sample of the oil in your engine, send it into Schaefer's. They'll run it through their lab tests and tell you, are there things like metal shavings or water in the oil, different things that can tell you little hints about the engine life on that particular vehicle. And doing this on a regular basis, maybe every time you do an oil change, is a really good way to monitor the long-term life of your engine. And by the way, I've driven a lot of different kinds of FedEx trucks in my career, and a lot of them, the sensors on the engine, so the check engine lights, the ABS lights, all the things that could pop up like a Christmas tree on the dash, a lot of those are not very good. And what I mean by that is they're going to give you false positives quite often, especially on the engine and on the coolant system. So you got to really be careful. If your driver sees one, it might be legitimate or it might not. If they see a light pops up on the dash, they need to tell you about it, but it may or may not be legitimate. The thing about an engine, if you're not familiar with these big trucks, the thing about an engine is that unlike the brakes, which will start to squeal, or your power steering that's going to groan, when you turn it side to side, the engine in general is not going to give you a lot of hints that it's going out or it's about to blow up. Now, it's not to say you won't hear anything or smell something that smells off. It's not that that'll never happen, but in general, the engine is pretty much going to go until it doesn't go anymore. So you really, really need to make sure you protect the life of that engine. Not to mention, it is the most expensive repair you will make on a truck if an engine goes out. Make sure you take care of that engine. Now, here's where I think will be really valuable for a lot of people kind of not familiar with these bigger trucks. And what are some of the intervals of maintenance that I need to perform on these trucks? Well, I'm going to give you some numbers here on the P&D side and then on the line haul side. So on the P&D side, we're going to talk about tires, brakes, oil, and fuel filter. So how often should you be replacing these things? Now, big caveat before I give you these figures. These are very route dependent. As Josh was talking about, if you're operating in downtown Chicago and your routes are only doing 3 to 5 miles a day on very smooth, easy city streets, not a lot of excess braking, these intervals are going to be much higher than what they would be if you're driving out in the middle of the country, constant harsh braking, things like that. We're really putting a strain on the vehicle in rough terrain. So there is a range here, but in general, for most routes, here's the ranges you're going to want to look at. For P&D, you're going to want to look at replacing your steer tires every 20 to 25,000 miles. Now, your rear tires, your drive tires, are going to be 30 to 35,000 miles. Now, one thing to be aware of on step vans, if you have step vans, is sometimes the rear axle, even though the axle is the drive axle, one of the wheels is typically getting more of the torque than the other one. And that may have changed in more recent model years, but the older ones, if you get one that's like, in the mid 2000s or early 2010s, you might have one that the right rear wheel is getting almost all of the torque. And you're going to notice it's going to wear down much faster than the other one. So watch for the comparison side to side, and then know what the differences are going to be from your steer axle and your drive axle. So that's tires. Brakes, it's going to be a little bit higher. You're going to want to replace the brakes every 25 to 30,000 miles on your fronts, 40 to 45,000 miles on the rears. And then when it comes to your oil and fuel filter, roughly every 10K is what you're going to want to replace those at. Maybe the fuel filter, if you're not noticing a lot of buildup and a lot of grime on those fuel filters, you can do that every other oil change. We've done that before. But in general, 10K is going to be about the mileage range you want to get out of that oil and fuel filter. Now on the line haul side, again, very dependent on the run. If your run goes from Oklahoma City over the mountains in Colorado over to Sacramento, you're going to have a very different tire mileage expectation than you would a run that says go from Memphis to Atlanta, which is very flat, right? So be aware of that. But in general, you're going to replace tires every 150 to 200,000 miles. Brakes are going to get replaced roughly every 300,000 miles. Again, very dependent on that mountainous terrain. And then the oil and fuel filter every 40 to 50,000 miles. And that's going to be less than the manufacturer's recommendation. And that's because a lot of times they're going to tell you a number. But if you notice, when you have someone, a good mechanic is going to be able to go in there and spot this oil doesn't look right, or especially if you send it in for an engine analysis and that that engine is really throwing off some shavings, you may want to knock that number down even further. So 40 to 50,000 miles for the oil and fuel filter on the line haul side. Those are pretty general ranges for both P&D and line haul trucks. Now, one more thing I want to talk about is people always ask, when do I get my own mechanic? How many trucks or how many routes, how many runs should I have before I hire my own mechanic? How many routes can justify having that as a full-time position? The answer is about 15 to 20 in general. Now you're going to see, again, there's always a range, there's always a caveat there, but 15 to 20 routes or runs is going to be a good time to start looking at bringing on somebody who is at least part-time in terms of being able to provide mechanical skill. Now, the reason I say that is because you might start with pulling a lead driver, somebody who is beside your BC, who has good mechanical skills. Now, it might be your BC, but if you're having your BC doing, your regular maintenance on the vehicles in terms of, replacing light bulbs, maybe even oil changes and things like that, things that can be done on the yard, then that's going to take time away from them that they're probably going to designate a lead driver to help them with other things like keeping up with the technology, making sure that every truck has a charging cord for the iPad and stuff like that. whatever the skill set is, pull somebody in first before you hire somebody full-time. See if someone on your team has mechanical knowledge and skill, and put them to work and see how much you can scale that opportunity up first before you bring on an outside resource. Now, they may or may not have their own tools. And there's going to be things like air wrenches and sort of the heavy duty items that you might not expect a mechanic to have on their own. So those might be sort of your fleet level tools, your enterprise level tools. Those might be something where you buy them yourself and then your mechanic uses them. But let's say your mechanic wants to buy them or wants to use them and take them with him when he leaves. Well, one incentive strategy you might give them is give him the opportunity to earn those tools, right? So if he really has his eye on that air wrench or that torque wrench that you're using for the tires, maybe he wants that eventually. Let him build up his pay, let him earn the hours to where he can eventually walk away and build his mechanic business from there. So again, it's not required that they have their own tools. Some things may want to own, some things you're going to want to ask a mechanic to bring in, but check and see what kind of tools are they bringing, see what kind of skills people on your own team have. Look inside before you look to external resources when it comes to hiring a mechanic. And Josh, that's really all I've got on the operational side.
Perfect. Yeah. And thanks, Jesse. So like I've said a couple of times, whether it's what I had to talk about, what Jesse had to talk about, anything about fleet, if you go ahead and put it in the Q&A, we will get to it in just a second. But I just wanted to come back and reemphasize what I mentioned earlier, which is we can show you what has worked for us and we can give you tips to run your fleet efficiently, but there's always going to be nuance to fit what your goals are and what your territory and route composition and run composition looks like. So you need to build the right strategy for you where you are today and to hold yourself to it to ensure that the business remains healthy. And if you're having challenges creating that strategy for your specific business or a business that you're reviewing or evaluating, just reach out to our team. We do it every day and we'd be happy to help. So now I'm going to go through our new listings, a couple of upcoming events, and then we'll get to the open Q&A. So as I'm talking, feel free to go ahead and put those questions in the chat and we'll get to them in just a second. So for new listings, first one is a P&D, FedEx P&D route out of Tennessee. It is 10 P&D routes at $700,000. This one does have a full-time manager, healthy fleet of 2016 or newer on the vehicle side, and spare vehicles available as well. Now, the rest of our new listings this week are all bread listings. So if you don't know what bread is, if you have questions on what a bread route looks like, we did a webinar on it last week and we've got content on our website that we can point you towards to help get a sense of what it is. But just an overview of the new listings we have on the bread side this week. We have one out of New Hampshire. It is one route as all of these are going to be. And so getting your head around the different terms, the different vernacular there is going to be a translation effect for a lot of you who've been exclusively focused on FedEx. There's a lot of similarities, but there's also some translation you're going to have to get used to. So there's one out of New Hampshire. It's $250,000. It has 9 weekly accounts. And then there's a truck option available to purchase as well. We've got another one out of West Virginia. It's a route at $150,000. And this one has 11 weekly accounts, doesn't include a vehicle, so it's something you'd have to bring in. And again, one of the main things, just as a highlight for those of you who are looking at these, that is going to be talked about in the kind of the valuation is the weekly revenue. It's kind of the most critical number to understand on the bread side. And so lots to talk about there. I don't want to go into it right now and make a whole webinar about breads. We just did it last week, but that is the figure you're going to see on a lot of these things. Minnesota, we have a route at $100,000, and this one does not include a vehicle either. And then the last one that's new on the bread side is out of North Carolina. It's one route at $285,000, and it does have a vehicle included in that price. Now, from an event perspective, a couple of things to highlight. First is if you are out West Coast area, California, and want to make a little bit of a drive, or Phoenix, which is where we're having the happy hour, we will be in Phoenix next week on October 18th. So I'll be there if you want to meet me in person. If you live close by, it's a great chance to network with our team, but also to network with other contractors, other investors in the area. So put the link in the chat right there, completely free to register. It is, we'll provide the food and the drinks. You just come in and have a good time. We also have a new investor summit coming up at the beginning of November. So November 6th and 7th and in person, and that's in person at our office in Nashville. If you've never heard about the summits, if you're still looking at the space, these are new investor summits that are designed to throw you into a crash course on the FedEx side and introduce you to everything we possibly can in 2 days. So Jesse and I, you'll see lots of our faces there and plenty of other people from the team. And we want you to come out of that event either knowing confidently that FedEx is the right space for you and you want to pursue it, or it's not, and that you can, if you're still looking at buying in the logistics space, you can look elsewhere. But we want that to be a kind of a crash course, teach you everything we can and help you make that decision. And then the last event that we always want to remind you on is that we have our expo, our giant contractor event every year. And our next one is in Dallas next summer. And that registration is open and the hotel block is open. It does sell out. So if you're looking for the discounted rates, the sooner you sign up, the better. That's really all you have to pay for is getting there and getting the hotel room. It's a completely free event to attend. Food and drink and activities and learning, everything's covered. You just got to find a way to get there. And if you want the cheapest hotel rates, the sooner the better. Okay. So after all that, everything I talked about, by the way, all those listings, all of those events are in the chat. So if you're looking for more details on that, it's all there. So Jesse and I are going to get to the Q&A now. So again, as I'm talking through the questions that are here, feel free to jump in and throw in your questions as well. So a question here from Alex is, Jesse, you talked some about oil analysis. So there are things that it might tell you. What would you do with that information? How do you act on the report that you get on the oil analysis size? And specific example, if it says that there's metal in your oil, what can you do about it? What's the next step from there?
Yeah, that's definitely something to indicate you need to call a certified mechanic ASAP. Now, obviously, that means metal is grinding on metal somewhere in your engine, which is the opposite of what it's supposed to be doing. So really make sure from the start, prevention is really more important here. So Alex, I don't want to say something specific that it definitely is. Sometimes it's an engine component that you can replace without having to replace the whole engine. But the better strategy is going to be when it comes to shavings, you're trying not to get to that point. And if they're not that severe, maybe it's something as simple as you just change out the viscosity of the oil that you're using and use a better quality of oil that's going to prevent that from getting worse. And some of these engines are made very, very well, many of them. So they're going to last you a long time. And so if you can kind of stop the shavings where they start, then you might just have sort of a one-off event. And then if you don't see them again, you're fine. But if you see them consistently, you're going to need to get a certified mechanic in there ASAP to diagnose, is this something that's a $10,000 repair, $20,000 repair, or maybe it's just an $800 part that can be repaired. So it really does kind of run the gamut.
Yeah. And Alex, that I'll give you an exact scenario. So we had one that came back and we found fuel in the oil, and turns out it was a fuel injector issue because it was identified in the oil analysis. Just like Jesse said, we replaced that part, which is about $2,000. Whereas if we had waited, it would have blown the engine and we would have had to replace that engine, which is 10, 15 more to replace. And so sometimes it's just getting the information to know, hey, there's something wrong. It hasn't appeared yet, but I should get it checked. And performing that check is going to save you money on the repair that could happen. It also, the other thing that I find that oil analysis helps a lot with is, you may have vehicles that all look the same in terms of their mileage, and you may think, oh, all of these are great. And then you do an oil analysis, and if you find some of those little things, even if it's not this vehicle's falling apart, those are little data points that help you decide when it's time to retire maybe one or two vehicles or rotate one into a spare position. I would start with the ones that have had some of those little difficulties. And then it's just extra data points to help kind of make relative comparisons to vehicles that may otherwise look exactly the same. All right, another one here from Ed. So he was asking, is there any software available to help track and monitor things like the maintenance schedule for vehicles?
Absolutely. There's a lot of good, really telematics options out there on the market Ford has a really good one. Actually, Hello Truck Lease has a very good telematics system built into the vehicles that they lease. Typically, the step vans that they're sending out have very good telematics that are monitored in-house, and you'll get alerts on things like fuel mileage, even things down to like the level of is the driver wearing the seatbelt. So yes, there's absolutely a lot of good options out there. As I said, Hello Truck Lease. There's another third-party option out there called Samsara, which is a worldwide company, very large company, offers some very, very good options on their telematics. So kind of look around and see which specific things you're wanting to measure. And I guarantee there's going to be an option out there for you.
Yeah, there's definitely ways to essentially be plugged into your vehicles and monitor that information. If you're looking for ways outside of that, just to have some kind of software to track it on your own and at least stay up with some of those monthly maintenance, or at least those different year and month thresholds that Jesse talked about for different types of repairs. There's technologies for that too. You shouldn't pay a ton. There's a lot of free or cheap options, things like fleet.io or Whip Around or GroundCloud all have options there. The other thing I would say is even if you're not going to pay for a software, I would at least make it some kind of task where you are regularly, whether it's you, a mechanic, or a BC, just kind of staying on top of and checking everything. And we have different reports we've used over the years that we can share and help with, but whether it's a software, telematics, probably some kind of combination of the two, to really have a comprehensive sense of your vehicles and tracking that scheduling. Another one here actually from Ed. So are there specific comparisons that are available to analyze kind of the total cost of ownership of owned versus leasing? And I can take that one. So I know for sure for Hello Truck Leasing, we have those exact models we can show you and kind of talk you through. So if you have questions on the P&D side, for sure. There are models as well on the leasing side for line haul. What it's really going to come down to, and really the same for P&D and line haul, is that mileage is going to have a big impact on how it'll affect the total cost of ownership. But for line haul, there's just much larger ranges for what the lease could look like and what the lease could cost. In particular, those team leases are pretty expensive right now for those sleepers. So yes, they have those broken out, and there's things you can look at there. We can at least show you pricing to compare it. They should have. We don't have, as directive access to the TCO breakout for the line haul leases, but most of those companies will have it. I know for sure that Hello Truck Leasing has it on the P&D side. One here for you, Jesse. Did you guys ever rotate tires much on your delivery vans? Any value in doing that?
Absolutely. You should never skip that. Yeah, that's a really good option. You need to be doing that regularly. Now, one thing you're going to be aware of, especially on the P&D trucks, and I believe this is the case on the line haul side, if I'm not mistaken, you're going to have a slightly different tire on the steer axle than on the drive axles. But be aware that sometimes you need a different kind of tire, a better kind of tire. Like let's say you've got a P500, a smaller size step van that does take a bigger tire, but it's running out in the country. You might want to have something that's a little bit beefier on the drive tires. So something that's, pretty, it almost looks like an off-road tire, like a scaled down off-road tire. So that might be something that you wouldn't want to put on the front. So it's not 100% of the time going to be the case, but if you have trucks that run all the same tires, absolutely, rotating is something you should be doing.
Perfect. All right, last one here. So as we're answering this last question, if I don't see another question come through, I'll go ahead and end it, but we'll stop with this one. So first, Jesse, can you repeat the suggested mileage to replace tires? And then did you ever really notice any difference between, using the cheapest tires and using some of those better brand name tires?
Yeah, absolutely. So Yulia, good question. So for P&D, the tire mileage intervals that we recommend is going to be 20 to 25,000 miles for the fronts. So for that steer axle, 20 to 25,000 miles. And then on the rear axle, those drive tires is going to be 30 to 35,000. Again, very CSA and terrain dependent, but in general, those are going to be some ranges to expect. And then it's in terms of are all tires created equal? No, they are absolutely not. There's a Bridgestone option out there that is significantly better over the long term. So it's over the short term, you're going to see comparable tread life, but over the long term, it's going to last much longer and be better for longer. And so, yeah, even if you spend a little extra, and a lot of times you're going to find, especially with that Bridgestone product, you're going to find that you're going to pay more on the front side by a little bit, but you're going to get way more mileage out of that tire on the rear end. And actually Bridgestone has a really good option on that in terms of sort of a pay as you go model that we can share more info about. But yeah, go for those premium tires, especially if you've got like country routes. It's really going to be important to extend the life of those tires as much as you can, and going for a premium option can be really good.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions come in. So Jesse, thank you so much for being here this week, always providing your insight and knowledge. And thanks everyone for joining this week. Again, lots of events, lots of things that we highlighted. So if you have questions on either the new listings or any of those upcoming events, just feel free to reach out to the team. And hopefully we will see you next week in Phoenix if you're there. And for everyone else, we will see you next week on the webinar. Thanks again for joining us here at Route Consultant.